Hello there, people of the internet. Interesting question. I had a young man ask me why the Mini 14 even exists. And they asked me that because the AR-15 exists, and they know that the AR-15 is significantly more customizable than something like the Mini 14. You can stick whatever you want on the various rails they have. You can easily mount like optics or lights or grips or lasers or whatever it is that you want to mount to your AR. You can heavily customize that versus something like a stock Mini 14. I mean, you could customize this, but it's not nearly as customizable. On top of that, they both take external mags, they both fire 223 ammunition. There's just a lot of reasons why the AR is a better platform in most instances than a Mini 14. So he asked me, hey, why does the Mini 14 even exist? So let's go ahead and dive right into that. I'm going to say the Mini 14 exists because this right here exists. This right here is an M1 Garand, however it is that you want to pronounce that. Chambered in 30-06, it is a self-loading, semi-automatic rifle in 30-06. This right here was the U.S. main battle rifle in World War II. It saw use after that, but the main thing that came from this that we're going to discuss is the M14. I do not have an M1A with me, technically not an M14, but I do not have an M1A with me, otherwise I would show that off. So I'm going to go ahead and show off the M1 Garand instead. But the M14 is essentially an M1 Garand in 308/762 NATO. Technically not the same cartridge, but just for the sake of this argument, we're going to call them the same cartridge. But it has an external magazine and a different gas system, but for all intents and purposes, it is essentially the same rifle. People love arguing that point because they're like, no, nothing is even interchangeable between these rifles. Well, that doesn't make Glock clones not Glocks. It's still pretty gosh darn close. Anyway, the M14 had clear inspiration from the design of the M1 Garand, which is not a bad thing. The M1 Garand is a fantastic design. Had a different gas system, but the M14 had some problems whenever it was adopted. As a matter of fact, it was, I think, the shortest rifle that the U.S. military has ever used, like kept in service. Lengthwise, like the amount of time they had the rifle in service, it was the shortest amount of time. And that's even taking the Krag Jorgensen into consideration that was adopted before the 1903 Springfield. The M14, it was uncontrollable in full auto. They were essentially fighting jungle warfare over there in Vietnam whenever this rifle really began to show up and make its debut. There was some other things that came before that, but I'd say Vietnam was really the nail in the coffin for the M14. On top of that, the M14, it fired a full power rifle cartridge. I'm trying to pick my words here very carefully so people who aren't gun people can like follow along and understand. It fires a full powered rifle cartridge, which is something that most countries were trying to get away of in lieu of a intermediate caliber cartridge, like a smaller cartridge so you could hold more ammunition, but the cartridge is still powerful enough, like more powerful than a pistol round, so the intermediate cartridge can touch out to distances that most people would need to touch out on. On top of that, it has less recoil, meaning that in full auto fire it is significantly more controllable. So the M14 had some pretty significant issues. Most people just used it as a semi-auto rifle from what I have been able to gather. But that being said, very quickly the M16 ended up being adopted instead. So there was some controversy behind the M16 adoption. That's not what this video is about. The M16 was ultimately adopted, and that is honestly a story in and of itself. So then, not too terribly long after the M16 came around, I'd say a decade or so, I can't quite remember when these things came out, but not too terribly long after the M16 ended up being adopted and put into service, the Mini 14 ended up coming out. This right here is basically a smaller copy of the M14. Now, why would somebody want that? Well, back whenever these rifles came out, the AR-15, the AR platform, was not very widely available and not very widely accepted among the U.S. civilian population or among police forces or anything like that. So your options were not very good for the AR platform, and the ARs back then were not all that reliable, not necessarily something that I would want to bet my life on for sure, versus something like this design right here, which has been around for a pretty significant long time, just with some updates. So they ended up, specifically Ruger, they ended up designing this firearm to be essentially a smaller, scaled-down version of the M14 chambered in .223. So you have the benefits of your intermediate. That's what I'm looking for. You have the benefits of your intermediate rifle round inside of a platform that people are just more familiar with, more comfortable with. On top of that, the Mini 14 is significantly simplified in comparison to the M14, and that means that this right here is going to be significantly cheaper and easier to produce. It's going to be significantly faster to produce. My own personal opinion, I feel like if the M14, or not the M14, if the Mini 14 here ended up coming out before the M16's adoption, I feel like this right here would have had a significant chance in being adopted in U.S. military service versus something like the AR platform, because this right here is just a more familiar design. Army ordinances during the time of the adoption of the M14 absolutely had biases towards a design like this. But the Mini 14, it basically does the same thing that the AR does. You got your external mag. This right here is a hunting mag because I'm going hog hunting. It's a 5-round, but you have the 30-round mags that stick out of these things. You can get 100-round drums. Bottom line is an external mag. You can have whatever capacity it is that you want, and it sends .223, 5.56 downrange. This particular one is a late 80s model. I think it is a 1 in 10 twist, so it does prefer your lighter rate bullets, but it will still stabilize at 62 grain bullets just fine. Ask me how I know. I've taken it out and actually tested that. You can go watch that video now. But it's a design that people already knew. It came out before the AR was really all that popular among civilians. The Mini 14 ended up being used in a ton of pop culture things. It ended up being used in law enforcement and whatnot. It ended up being used in various security implements. It ended up being used just by the civilian population in the United States by a pretty wide margin, simply because during the time period where it came out, it was just a more friendly design than something like the unknown AR, but you had all the benefits of that .223 cartridge. Then you had all the benefits of a shorter, lighter weight, lighter recoiling rifle than something like an M14. So there are some benefits to this. Nowadays, it's more or less a rifle that is for banned states, but hopefully the Supreme Court takes care of those bans. I don't foresee the Mini 14 going anywhere anytime soon, because a lot of people still do prefer your old school wood and steel design versus something like a scary looking AR. I know a lot of people will pick a rifle like this right here for defensive purposes, specifically because it looks less scary, and it still does essentially the same things that an AR does, just with less customization options. So hopefully that answered your question. There is a little bit more that I could go more in depth on in terms of like what was actually done to the Mini 14 to simplify it for means of production and things like that, but I think that I got my point across. Thanks for watching. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you all in the next episode. I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. The poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.